The sea smelled of diesel and blood. The sound of boots hitting wet sand drowned beneath the engine hum of U.S. landing craft. Inside, huddled together, 15 Japanese women in tattered khaki uniforms clutched their medical satchels. The youngest couldn't stop shaking. Salt water had dried on their faces like frost. None of them spoke. Each wave that slapped the metal hull felt like a heartbeat counting down to humiliation. When the ramp dropped, sunlight hit their eyes, bright, merciless American. Marines shouted commands they couldn't understand. The women stumbled out barefoot, one dragging a wounded comrade by the arm. Their captors' rifles glinted, but the muzzles didn't rise. The women had expected the worst, stripping, shouting, revenge. Instead, an American medic yelled, "Hold fire, POWs." The words meant nothing, but his tone did. It wasn't hate. It was procedure. They were led across the hot sand toward a canvas tent marked with a red cross. The women stared at the insignia. How could their enemy also use the sacred symbol of mercy? One nurse whispered, "They'll shame us before killing us." Another murmured, "Better to drown." But then, something unexpected happened. A Marine approached carrying a bundle of white cloth in both hands. Not weapons, not ropes, just folded white sheets. The prisoners froze. The medic knelt, placed the bundle carefully at their feet, and gestured awkwardly, miming how to open it. Inside weren't sheets at all, small rectangular pads, sterile, sealed in wax paper. The women exchanged terrified glances, unsure if it was a trick. The American gestured again, pointing to one of the women's skirts, then to the pads, explaining in broken words none of them understood, but somehow did. A sanitary supply for them. For the first time since capture, silence broke not from fear but confusion. The women didn't know whether to cry or laugh. "They treat our shame with care," one whispered. The medic didn't meet their eyes. He just nodded and walked away, leaving behind the white bundle glowing in the Pacific sun. That bundle would become the first crack in everything they believed about Americans. Next section continues how that simple cloth turned into the most bewildering lesson of their captivity. The bundle lay untouched for hours. The women stared at it like it might explode. One of them, Sergeant Aki Tanaka, finally reached out, her hands trembling as she peeled open the wax paper. The material was soft, white, and clean, too clean for war. It didn't smell of blood or oil, just faintly of paper and starch. The Americans watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. One of them, a medic barely 20, blushed as he mimed folding and fastening, trying to explain what it was for. Aki's face burned with shame. Japanese field nurses had always used torn rags, washed in freezing water, reused until they disintegrated. The idea of something disposable, something made purely for comfort, felt almost obscene. Why waste such purity on prisoners? She muttered. The answer, though she didn't know it yet, was simple, because to the Americans this was routine. Hygiene wasn't a luxury, it was protocol. Back home, she'd been taught that the enemy were savages, men who laughed while women screamed. Yet here was a man too embarrassed to meet her eyes, handing her something to preserve her dignity. Cognitive dissonance hit like a wave. Aki felt her throat tighten. She wasn't sure whether to trust or recoil. The medic said softly, "For you, it's okay." She didn't understand the words, but the tone, gentle, hurried, awkward, cut through the language barrier like a scalpel. Reports indicate that since 1942, U.S. Army field medics carried sanitary pads as standard issue for female personnel, and even used them for wound dressings due to their absorbency. Japan's Imperial Army, in contrast, had no equivalent. The women realized they were being offered something they'd never been deemed worthy of by their own side: comfort without conditions. That night, under dim lantern light, Aki showed the others how to use the pads. The laughter that followed wasn't mockery. It was disbelief, release, exhaustion. The white cloth had become a symbol of something forbidden, tenderness in wartime. For a moment they forgot the fear. The Pacific wind rattled the canvas walls, carrying with it the sound of a distant American radio playing jazz. And as they lay down on thin mats, one thought burned through their silence: if the enemy could show mercy, what else had been a lie? The next morning they'd find out. The medics weren't just bringing hygiene, they were bringing care. The next morning, the smell of antiseptic filled the tent sharp, sterile, nothing like the sickly sweetness of battlefield wounds. Aki blinked awake to see an American medic boiling metal tools in a tin pot. The sound of it, soft bubbling over a portable stove, felt eerily domestic. The women had been trained to expect interrogation or abuse. Instead, they were lined up for medical inspection. Next, the medic called, his voice calm, almost bored. Procedure, routine, order in a place where everything else had collapsed. He knelt beside one of the nurses whose foot was swollen and cracked from weeks of retreat through coral mud. Without hesitation, he dipped gauze in iodine and began cleaning the wound, careful not to cause pain. The woman flinched when he touched her skin. No Japanese officer had ever done that gently. The medic muttered something about infection risk, then wrapped her foot in bandages so white they almost glowed. She whispered half to herself, "He touched me as if I was human." Outside, waves hissed against the beach. The Americans moved with quiet discipline, tagging, recording, disinfecting every step documented. There was no mockery, no shouting. Just a rhythm of efficiency. For a people raised under slogans of purity and hierarchy, it was shattering. Their captors didn't act superior, they acted professional. U.S. medical logs show over 132 zero-axis POW were processed under Geneva Convention hygiene standards. To the Japanese who'd never expected mercy, this looked like madness. Why help the enemy? One nurse asked through a translator. The medic shrugged because infection spreads. His logic was clinical, but the impact wasn't. That night, Aki watched him disinfect his own scraped knuckle with the same care he'd given them. That tiny act erased another layer of propaganda. In her diary, written secretly on the back of ration wrappers, she scribbled, "They wash even their hands before tending to us. Cleanliness as respect." The tent smelled of soap and iodine, not fear, and that scent would haunt them more than any battlefield stench. For the first time, Aki began to wonder if humanity wasn't divided by flags, but by habits who cleaned wounds and who caused them. But the shock wasn't over. Beyond hygiene, another revelation waited in, the way Americans enforced restraint even when no one was watching. The routine of kindness was more unsettling than cruelty could ever be. The women had memorized government leaflets warning that capture meant dishonor, torture, and death. Yet here, in a Pacific POW camp, every day chipped away at that script. Guards saluted officers politely. Medics checked on patients twice a day. When a soldier lingered too long near the women's tent, an American officer barked, "Eyes front. Rules are rules." The same phrase they'd heard used for battlefield discipline. Respect enforced like gunfire. Aki couldn't reconcile it. Her whole life she'd been told Americans were devils in human form, yet the devils offered blankets when the rain came. They issued toothbrushes. One guard even taught them how to fold paper napkins into triangles before meals. She caught herself saying "thank you" in English without thinking, then felt guilty for it. Japanese field propaganda had been specific. Captured women will be shamed. But reports later revealed that over 70% of Japanese POW interviewed by Allied intelligence said they were most shocked not by harshness but by restraint. It terrified them. Discipline, mercy, and predictability were weapons they hadn't trained to face. Aki wrote in her hidden diary, "They treat us like patients, not prisoners." Perhaps mercy is their tactic. She wasn't wrong. Allied command had learned that humane treatment yielded cooperation and propaganda collapse. Every polite gesture was a quiet strike against Tokyo's myth machine. One evening, as the women queued for dinner, an American lieutenant walked past and noticed a Marine staring too long. The officer stopped mid-step, turned and said coldly, "Do it again, you're out of this camp." The Marine muttered, "Yes, sir," eyes down. Aki didn't understand the words, but she caught the tone: authority, protecting her, not threatening. That moment rewrote something deep inside her. Later that night, she whispered to her bunkmate, "They follow rules even when they hate us." Her friend replied, "Maybe that's why they're winning." Outside, floodlights buzzed in the humid air, cutting clean lines across the compound fence. Inside, the women sat in stunned silence, realizing that every kindness was not weakness, but power. And the next test of that power would come through their stomachs, in the smell of frying meat and bitter coffee. The smell hit first. Fat sizzling on metal, coffee percolating in tin mugs. For women who had survived on watery rice and roots, it was intoxicating. Breakfast in the American camp was chaos and abundance. Canned spam sliced thick, bread stacked like bricks, coffee poured, until it sloshed over the rim. Aki stood frozen in line, her hands trembling around a dented tray. The scent alone made her dizzy. Around her, Marines laughed, shouted, traded jokes she couldn't understand. None of them looked hungry. That, more than anything, felt unreal. When she reached the front, a cook wearing a grease-stained apron grinned and dropped 2 slabs of spam onto her plate. Then, without ceremony, he spooned white rice beside it. "Thought you folks like that," he said. She didn't catch the words, but the gesture pierced straight through. Rice, the sacred food of Japan, offered by the enemy. Later, in the mess tent, the women sat cross-legged, cautious. The first bite was mechanical. The second, tears, real tears. The food was salty, greasy, almost too rich after months of starvation. But it was enough. One nurse whispered, "Even their prisoners eat better than our soldiers." She wasn't exaggerating. By 1945, U.S. Army rations averaged 700 calories per day, while Japanese frontline troops often survived on less than 800, sometimes half that in the Pacific Islands. The Americans didn't notice the women's disbelief. To them, feeding prisoners properly was just logistics. To the women, it was another fracture in the propaganda that had defined their world. Every plate of spam was a message. Power didn't need cruelty to prove itself. Aki watched an American toss leftovers into a metal bin, half a sandwich, a chunk of fruit. She stared, stunned. That waste alone could have fed her unit for a day. "Their trash is richer than our officers' meals," one woman muttered bitterly. Yet beneath the bitterness, curiosity stirred. If these men had so much that waste was casual, maybe the war had been lost long before the first shot she ever fired. That night, Aki practiced a new word she'd overheard, "thank you." Her accent bent it awkwardly, but her heart carried it clean. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd say it out loud, because gratitude, too, was forbidden, and she was ready to break that rule. By the next week, one of the quieter nurses had become the camp's small mystery. Her name was Michiko Kondo 22, fluent in silence, eyes sharp as glass. Unlike Aki, she didn't just observe the Americans, she studied them. Every phrase, every gesture, every rhythm of their strange routines fascinated her. When guards laughed, she mimicked their tones under her breath. When they counted supplies, 1, 2, 3, she mouthed the numbers until she could whisper them without pause. It wasn't obedience, it was curiosity disguised as survival. One afternoon, Michiko lingered near the medical tent where an American nurse, Lieutenant Evelyn Moore, was inventorying bandages. Evelyn noticed her peeking in and smiled. "Come in," she said slowly, tapping her chest. "Evelyn." Michiko hesitated, then pointed to herself. "My Kaiko." The sound came out soft, hesitant, but Evelyn clapped lightly, delighted. She rummaged through a box and pulled out a flattened cardboard wrapper from a pack of sanitary pads, handed it to Michiko, and wrote on it in pencil, "Freedom." Michiko traced the letters with a trembling finger. "Freedom," she repeated, syllable by syllable. Evelyn nodded, smiling. To both of them, the word meant different things, but in that humid, fly-filled tent, it bridged 2 worlds that had been enemies yesterday. Reports suggest that over 100 Japanese women POW were literate nurses or clerks. Many kept secret diaries, sketchbooks, or language lists, smuggled inside medical kits. Michiko was one of them. Each night, she scribbled new words learned from the guards: water, food, bandage, thank you. The vocabulary of captivity became the vocabulary of awakening. She began helping the Americans communicate with the other nurses, translating gestures into sense. Drink, she'd say, handing water. Sleep, pointing to cots. The guards started calling her teacher. She blushed each time. But whispers crept through the tents. Rumors said Tokyo radio had declared that captured women would be branded traitors, even executed for dishonor if they ever returned. Michiko's new voice, her growing fluency, suddenly felt dangerous. Still, that scrap of cardboard with freedom scrawled across it stayed hidden in her pocket. It wasn't defiance, it was identity. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. And soon, when the women were told to write letters home under Red Cross supervision, Michiko knew exactly what her first English sentence would be. The order came quietly: write home. Eki and Michiko sat at a wooden table beneath a dim lantern as Red Cross officers distributed paper, pens, and envelopes stamped approved for civilian correspondence. The air felt heavy with disbelief. For months, they had been ghosts cut off from everything they'd known. Now, suddenly, they were being asked to speak to the world again. But what could they say? The truth, that their enemies treated them humanely, was as dangerous as any weapon. Michiko gripped her pen, staring at the blank sheet. She had rehearsed English phrases in her mind for weeks. Across from her, a U.S. officer explained through a translator, "Keep it simple, no military details, just family." The translator's voice wavered. Everyone understood the subtext: letters might never reach Japan, and even if they did, they might never be read. Finally, Michiko began to write. "Dear Mother, I am alive. They are not monsters." Her hand shook. She paused, then carefully folded the page, as if the act itself might summon home from across the Pacific. Statistics tell the rest. Fewer than 10% of Japanese POW letters ever reached their destinations. Many were intercepted or destroyed by Japanese censors who viewed captured soldiers as already dead. Michiko didn't know that. She only knew she had poured a forbidden truth onto that page, that compassion could exist in the enemy camp. Nearby, Aki was writing too, but her letter was different. "Do not worry about my honor," she wrote. "It is still mine." When she finished, she pressed the envelope to her forehead before handing it over. The Red Cross officer smiled faintly, stacking the letters like fragile truce offerings. That night, as rain lashed the tin roof, Michiko whispered to Aki, "If my mother reads this, she will burn it." Aki replied, "Maybe she will keep the ashes." The two women lay awake, listening to thunder roll across the ocean. Each rumble sounded like a heartbeat fading into distance, a reminder that war was still raging somewhere beyond the fence. Weeks later, the camp loudspeakers would crackle with a new sound: not thunder, not orders, but something else entirely. A voice announcing an end none of them dared believe. The war itself was about to vanish overnight. It began with static, then a voice, flat, foreign, urgent, echoed through the camp loudspeakers. The American guards froze mid-step. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Japan has surrendered." The sentence hung in the humid air like smoke. For a long moment, no one moved. The prisoners stared at each other, blank, faced, unable to process words that rewrote the universe. Eki's spoon slipped from her hand and clattered on the tin tray. Michiko's breath caught in her throat. Home had fallen without warning, without honor, without applause. Outside, an American officer took off his cap, his face unreadable. "It's over," he said quietly to no one in particular. The guards didn't cheer. There was no triumph, no music, no shouts of victory. Only silence and the distant hiss of waves breaking against the shore. To the Japanese women, that restraint felt stranger than any celebration could have. They had been told their enemies would dance over their graves. Instead, they stood still, respectful, almost mournful. Reports confirm that on September 2, 1945, over 1.6 million Japanese soldiers were in Allied custody when the surrender was formalized aboard the USS Missouri. But here in this small camp in the Pacific, that massive geopolitical shift arrived as a whisper through a tin speaker. Aki looked up at the sky and muttered, "So we lost." Michiko whispered, "Maybe we are free." But the word free didn't feel real yet. The camp remained fenced, the guards still carried rifles, meals were still rationed, roll calls still called. Liberation, they realized, was a process, not an event. Later that evening, the American lieutenant who had enforced discipline among the guards walked through the camp. He stopped in front of the women's tent and said simply, "You'll be going home soon." His tone was firm, not celebratory. It was the sound of responsibility, not victory. Aki watched him walk away, the edges of his uniform catching the last gold light of sunset. She thought of the sanitary pads, the clean bandages, the quiet rules, and wondered which army had truly been civilized. But going home would not mean peace. For many of them, the war would begin again the moment they stepped off the ship. The ship docked in Yokohama beneath a grey, silent sky. No banners, no embraces, no songs, just the hiss of steam and the shuffle of boots on metal. Aki and Michiko clutched small satchels of their belongings, a comb, a few photographs, and that folded wrapper with the word freedom. Behind them, other women disembarked in neat lines, faces expressionless. Onshore Japanese officials waited stiffly. They took names, stamped documents, avoided eye contact. To them, these weren't heroes returning, they were stains. Proof of surrender made flesh. When Aki's turn came, an officer glanced at her papers and muttered, "Captured personnel." His pen paused before the word female. The ink bled slightly on the page, like a wound refusing to close. He didn't look up, dismissed. That was it. No welcome, no acknowledgement. The women stepped onto home soil as if trespassing. Post-war surveys estimate that over 60% of female POW in Japan were ostracized or disowned. Families feared association with shame. Neighbors whispered that captured women must have been defiled, even when records proved otherwise. In towns scarred by bombing and hunger, their return wasn't seen as survival, it was seen as contamination. Michiko's home village was no different. Her father, once proud of her nursing service, refused to speak to her. "Better you had died with honor," he said, turning away. She bowed low, her forehead touching the dirt, but he didn't move. That night, she slept outside the family gate, the sound of cicadas filling the silence her father left behind. Aki fared no better. Hospitals refused to rehire her. Former colleagues avoided her on the street. The mercy she'd experienced in captivity became an unspoken crime. Japan's shame demanded amnesia, and she was a living contradiction. Years passed, the world rebuilt. America moved on, victorious and confident. Japan rebuilt too, but its survivors carried quieter ruins inside them. One autumn afternoon, Michiko visited a small museum in Tokyo dedicated to wartime nurses. In a glass drawer lay a single relic, a yellowed sanitary pad wrapper, identical to the one she'd kept all those years. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered, "We were seen." Tears blurred her reflection. The paper was fragile, but it had outlived every lie she'd been taught. And in that moment, memory turned into defiance, and defiance into peace. Decades later, the Pacific was calm again. The old wounds had faded, but for Michiko Kondo, one relic refused to disappear. The yellowed sanitary pad wrapper she kept in a wooden box. She lived alone in a narrow Tokyo apartment lined with books and photographs. Each morning, she opened the box like a ritual, smoothing the brittle paper as if touching time itself. The letters freedom, still faintly visible in English pencil, had not faded. Every crease held the memory of that tent, that moment when an enemy showed care instead of cruelty. She had become a nurse again, quietly, humbly, tending to the post, or a generation that knew nothing of the island camps. When visiting students asked her about the war, she didn't start with battles or flags. She began with that white cloth. This, she'd say softly, holding it up, changed everything I believed about enemies. The students would lean forward, unsure whether to believe her. Mercy, after all, didn't fit the war stories they'd been taught. By the 1990s, historians had begun collecting oral testimonies from surviving Japanese POW. Michiko's was among the last recorded in 1995, the 50th anniversary of the surrender. Her voice on tape was thin but steady. They treated our wounds and our shame. I thought humanity had died in war, but it survived quietly in a medic's hands. She paused before adding, "Mercy is stronger than victory." The interviewer asked if she ever forgave Japan for forgetting her. Michiko smiled faintly. "I forgave the silence, but I remember the kindness." When she passed away in 1998, her personal effects were donated to the small museum she'd once visited. The curators placed the wrapper beside her photograph, a young woman in a faded uniform, eyes both haunted and defiant. The label beneath reads simply, "Japanese nurse captured 1945, kept this for 53 years. Visitors often paused longest at her display. Some wept quietly, others just stared, realizing that history isn't made only of generals and guns, but of moments so small they fit in a medic's hand. The white cloth had begun as hygiene. It ended as testimony, a fragment of decency that outlived the war that tried to erase it. And in the stillness of that museum, under glass and silence, the story whispered one final truth: compassion leaves deeper marks than any bullet.